"My gift is you," said the Apache warrior. A Christmas night that changed everything. The winter had arrived with a quiet fierceness. The world seemed to hold its breath under a thick blanket of snow, and the wind carried a sharp, biting cold that could cut through even the sturdiest coat. The forests were silent except for the occasional creak of frozen branches or the soft fall of fresh snow on the ground. In the midst of this vast, white landscape, a small family moved carefully along a narrow trail, their footsteps muffled by the thick snow. They were travelers, weary from weeks on the road, and each step seemed heavier than the last. The young woman walked slightly behind her family, clutching a small bundle close to her chest. Her eyes were wide with both fear and determination. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, but she forced herself to keep moving. There was no other choice. Her family had lived a life filled with hardships, as many families in the frontier did. There had been sickness that took loved ones in the night, fires that destroyed homes, and hunger that gnawed at their stomachs when the harvests failed. But despite all the pain, there had always been hope. And hope, she believed, was the only thing that kept people going. This Christmas, though, hope felt fragile, almost like it could shatter at any moment. They were traveling to a distant settlement hoping to find safety, warmth, and a fresh start, but the land around them seemed endless, empty, and unforgiving. The young woman's mind wandered as they walked. She remembered Christmases from her childhood, filled with laughter and the smell of warm bread and pine from the trees. She remembered sitting by the fire with her siblings, sharing stories and gifts that were often small but precious. Those memories felt like treasures now, distant and almost unreachable, as if they belonged to another life entirely. She held on to them tightly, letting the memories of warmth and love keep the cold at bay. Suddenly the wind shifted, blowing across the trail with a sharper bite. The trees groaned under the weight of the snow, and the sky darkened as if warning them of the approaching night. The family quickened their pace, their breaths forming clouds in the freezing air. But the trail became treacherous. Snow-covered roots and hidden rocks made each step dangerous. A misstep could mean a fall, or worse, being lost in the vast wilderness. The young woman's heart raced as she struggled to keep up, her fingers numb, her face stinging from the icy wind. Her parents moved steadily, careful to watch each other, but even they could not hide the strain of exhaustion in their eyes. And then it happened. A sudden crack echoed through the stillness of the forest, a sound that made her heart leap into her throat. The snow beneath one of her father's feet gave way, sending him tumbling down a small embankment. She screamed, running forward, but the snow was slippery and deep. By the time she reached him, he was struggling to get up, his hands bleeding from a scrape he had taken on a sharp rock. Her mother rushed to help him, worry etched into every line of her face. The young woman's own hands shook as she tried to assist, but in that moment the harsh reality of their situation hit her. This land was dangerous. It did not care for their hopes or dreams. It only demanded vigilance, strength, and a bit of luck to survive. By the time they managed to regain their footing, darkness had begun to fall. The sun had long since disappeared behind the horizon, leaving only a dim, gray light that made it hard to see the path ahead. The forest seemed different in this fading light, its shadows stretching long and threatening, its silence heavy. Every sound was amplified. The crackle of ice underfoot, the whistle of the wind through the trees, the distant call of an unseen animal. The young woman felt fear curl around her heart like a living thing. They needed to find shelter, and quickly, before the cold became unbearable. But the forest offered nothing but endless snow and looming trees. There were no cabins, no signs of other travelers, no comforting lights in the distance. They were alone. As night fell completely, the temperature dropped sharply. The young woman's teeth chattered despite the thick layers she wore, and her fingers felt like they were made of ice. Her parents looked weary, their faces pale in the dim moonlight reflecting off the snow. She knew they had hoped to reach the settlement before nightfall, but now it seemed impossible. Panic began to rise inside her, and she had to fight it down, forcing herself to breathe steadily. She reminded herself that she had survived harsh winters before. She had seen her family through difficult times. She could get through this too. But then another danger appeared. The wind shifted again, stronger this time. carrying a sharp edge that cut through their clothing and seemed to push them backward with every step. Snow began to fall, not gently, but in heavy flakes that blinded them and made every movement exhausting. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. They could no longer see the trail clearly, and the fear of becoming lost in this frozen wilderness grew. Her mother tried to keep spirits up, singing a low, trembling hymn that spoke of hope and of a safe journey. The sound was comforting, but only slightly, and the young woman could see the worry in her mother's eyes. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time seemed meaningless in the freezing dark. The young woman kept her eyes fixed ahead, scanning the shadows for anything that could be shelter, anything that could save them from the cold night. Her thoughts drifted to her siblings, to her home, to the life she had left behind. She thought about Christmas, and how different this night was from all the ones she had known. Instead of warmth and joy, there was fear and uncertainty. And yet, she clung to the hope that somehow, somewhere, there would be safety. Somewhere, someone would guide them through this night. Then, in the dim light, she saw movement. At first, she thought it was a trick of the snow and shadows. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized there was something, or someone, watching them from the trees. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She stepped closer to her family instinctively, feeling both fear and curiosity. The movement was cautious, almost silent, but undeniably present. She did not know who or what it could be. And yet in that vast empty forest, she felt an odd sense of being seen, of being observed with attention rather than threat. It was a strange feeling in a night filled with danger. Her father noticed her staring and followed her gaze. His eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows, but he saw nothing. He whispered for her to stay close, to keep moving. And yet, the young woman could not shake the feeling that this presence was important, that it might change the course of their night. She tried to focus on the trail, on the small light of hope that led them toward the settlement, but her mind kept returning to the movement in the darkness. She could feel it watching, waiting, as if deciding what to do next. She did not know it yet, but this night would be unlike any other she had experienced. It would mark the beginning of something extraordinary, something that would change her life forever. The family continued on, moving slowly but steadily. Their breaths came out in visible clouds, and each step required effort. The young woman felt the snow pressing against her boots, soaking through her socks despite the layers. Her cheeks were red and raw from the wind, and her hands were stiff with cold. She wanted to give up, to sink into the snow, and let the night take them. But she forced herself to keep walking. She reminded herself that this was only one night, one trial, and that morning might bring help. Morning might bring warmth. Morning might bring life. As the night deepened, the young woman held her small bundle closer, feeling its weight against her chest. She thought about what she would do if they did not survive, if the cold or the forest claimed them. She felt fear, but also determination. She knew that fear could be a guide, could sharpen her senses and keep her alive, but she could not let it rule her. She had to move, to survive, to protect her family. Every step, every careful placement of her feet became a small victory. She reminded herself that hope, even in its smallest form, could light the darkest night. Hours passed, and still the forest stretched on, endless and silent. But despite the cold and the danger, the young woman felt a strange sense of anticipation, a quiet stirring in her chest that she did not fully understand. Something was coming, something she could not see yet, but it felt important. The presence she had noticed earlier seemed closer now, though still unseen, and in that realization, she found a small measure of comfort. Even in the darkest, coldest night, she was not entirely alone. And that thought, fragile and fleeting though it was, carried her forward into the unknown. The young woman and her family had been moving for hours through the dark, snow-covered forest, each step a struggle against the wind and cold. Her legs ached, her hands were stiff, and her thoughts swirled with fear and exhaustion. The presence she had felt earlier in the shadows still lingered at the edge of her mind, She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, that the forest was playing tricks in the dim moonlight, but a small voice inside whispered that she was being watched, and she could not ignore that feeling. Suddenly, a noise cracked through the forest. It was soft, almost like the sound of a branch breaking under careful weight, but it made her heart leap into her throat. She froze and pressed closer to her mother. Her father immediately held a hand over her mother's mouth, signaling silence. The snow around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The young woman's eyes darted through the trees, but the darkness was thick, and the shapes of the forest twisted in her imagination. Her mind raced with possibilities. Wolves, thieves, or worse, but the way the sound had moved made her doubt that it was an animal. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were intelligent, cautious, and close. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. At first, she could not make out much. Just a movement, a silhouette against the white snow. The figure was fast, quiet, and confident, moving with a grace that seemed almost unnatural in the forest. The young woman instinctively stepped back, shielding herself with her arms. Her family followed her lead, standing close together as if their combined presence could protect them. Her father whispered for her to stay calm, but his own voice shook, betraying his fear. She noticed then that this stranger did not carry any obvious weapons, at least not visible ones, and yet the way he moved suggested he could handle danger if it arose. The figure stopped a few paces away. The young woman saw his face now, partially hidden beneath a hood of fur and snow. His eyes were dark, sharp, and alert, scanning the family as carefully as they were scanning him. There was no hostility in his gaze, but there was caution, a watchfulness born of experience. He made no sudden movements. Instead, he studied them silently, like a hunter assessing the forest before making a move. The young woman felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. Who was this man? Why was he here, watching them? And why did she feel, somehow, that he might help rather than harm them? Before she could think further, he spoke, his voice low but clear. "Do not be afraid," he said. The sound was unexpected, almost melodic in the quiet of the forest. It was not a threat, not a demand. It was a statement, calm and steady. The young woman's mother let out a small sigh of relief, but her father remained tense, eyes never leaving the figure. She could not understand his words completely, but the tone was enough to give her a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this stranger was not an enemy. Perhaps he was something else entirely, a guide, a protector, someone who could help them survive the night. The stranger stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact. He made a small gesture with his hand, pointing toward a slight clearing nearby. The young woman hesitated, then glanced at her family. Her mother nodded slightly, signaling that they should follow, but her father's expression remained cautious. He whispered to her, "We stay together." No sudden moves. She nodded, gripping the small bundle she carried even tighter. The stranger began walking again, and after a moment of tense silence, the family followed. As they moved through the snow, the young woman noticed the way the stranger navigated the forest. Every step was precise. He avoided hidden roots, loose snow, and obstacles with ease, moving almost as if he could see the path before it existed. She had never seen anyone move through the wilderness like that. His presence was steadying, like a calm current in the midst of a storm. She began to feel a sense of trust, though she would not have admitted it aloud. Even her father, though still wary, followed without argument. The clearing the stranger led them to was small but sheltered. It was surrounded by trees that blocked the worst of the wind, and the snow was not as deep as on the trail. He gestured for them to sit, and without speaking, began gathering small branches and twigs to start a fire. The young woman watched him work, fascinated. There was a quiet skill to everything he did, each movement deliberate, each choice precise. He struck flint against stone, and sparks flew, landing on dry twigs. The smell of smoke rose immediately, and the warmth began to push back the biting cold. The young woman felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time in hours, she felt that perhaps they would survive the night. As the fire crackled and grew, the young woman dared to look at the stranger more closely. He wore clothing made of fur and leather, stitched together in practical patterns that suggested experience and knowledge of the harsh winter. There was a quiet strength in him, a discipline that made her think he had lived many winters like this before. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, seemed to carry stories he would not tell, and yet there was a kindness there, hidden beneath layers of caution. She wondered what had brought him to this forest, why he had chosen to intervene. The young woman's father finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Who are you?" he asked. The stranger did not answer immediately. He looked at each of them in turn, then finally spoke. "I am one who walks the land," he said. "I have seen many travelers lost. I do not harm unless I must. You are safe here, for now." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The young woman felt a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. Who was he, and why had he chosen to help them, when many others might have left them to the forest? Night deepened around them, and the cold seemed to press closer. Yet beside the fire there was warmth, not just from the flames, but from the quiet sense of safety the stranger provided. The young woman felt her fear begin to ebb, replaced by a cautious hope. She listened to the way he moved, to the way he prepared the fire and arranged the clearing. There was a rhythm to his actions, a quiet certainty that was almost comforting. For the first time that night she allowed herself to breathe more fully. Perhaps they would survive this. Perhaps this night would end differently than she had feared. As the fire burned, they began to share what little food they had. The young woman's mother offered small pieces of dry bread and jerky, and the stranger accepted them without question. They ate in silence at first, the crackling fire the only sound between them. Then slowly the stranger spoke again. "This land is harsh," he said. "It does not forgive mistakes, but those who respect it, who move carefully and wisely, can survive." The young woman listened, feeling a strange sense of understanding. He was not giving them orders, not demanding obedience. He was sharing knowledge, offering guidance without forcing it. Hours passed, and the night grew colder still. The family huddled close to the fire, and the young woman found herself watching the stranger. There was a quiet dignity about him, a sense of purpose that was rare in a world so full of danger. She wanted to ask him more, to understand who he was and why he had helped them. But words felt small and inadequate in the presence of such calm strength. Instead, she listened, letting the warmth of the fire and the steady presence of the stranger fill her with a sense of hope she had not felt in a long time. At one point, the stranger stood and looked toward the trees, listening. The young woman could see him tense slightly, as if aware of every sound in the forest. He returned to the fire, his movements smooth and careful. "Rest now," he said softly. "Sleep if you can. The forest is safer here, but the night is long." The words were not a command, but an offer of comfort. The young woman felt the tension in her body begin to ease. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to sit back and relax, trusting that, at least for now, they were protected. The night continued, and the wind howled outside the clearing, but inside, there was warmth, safety, and quiet. The young woman thought of the firelight dancing on the snow, of the way the stranger's eyes reflected it, and felt a sense of awe. She had never met anyone like him, someone who could be so strong, so quiet, and so kind at the same time. She began to understand that this night, this meeting, would change her life. She did not know how, and she did not yet understand what it would mean, but she could feel the weight of it pressing gently against her heart. As she finally closed her eyes, letting herself rest against the warmth of her family and the fire, she made a promise to herself. She would survive this night. She would remember this stranger, this night in the forest, and the lesson that even in the coldest, darkest places, there could be kindness and hope. And somewhere deep in her heart, she felt that this was only the beginning. This was the start of a story she would carry with her forever. The night grew deeper, and the forest outside the clearing seemed endless, dark and cold. The wind howled among the trees, carrying icy snow that beat against the branches, but inside the small circle of fire there was warmth. The young woman sat close to her family, feeling the comforting heat on her face and hands. Yet even with the fire and the warrior's presence, her mind remained restless. She kept thinking about the journey that had brought them here, the dangers they had faced, and the mysterious figure who had saved them. At first the conversation was quiet, almost hesitant. Words felt fragile in the shadow of the forest. The young woman's mother broke the silence with soft murmurs about their journey, about small victories like finding food and making it this far through the snow. She spoke with a trembling voice, but there was warmth in her words, a warmth that matched the fire. The young woman listened, grateful for the comfort of her mother's presence, but she found herself stealing glances at the warrior. He moved slowly around the fire, adding small twigs to keep it alive, and even though he said little, his eyes spoke volumes. There was a story in them, a story of survival, of loss, of life lived in the harshest conditions. Finally, the warrior spoke. His voice was low, steady, and calm, carrying through the quiet forest. "The land is not cruel," he said. "It only teaches lessons." The words were strange, almost like a riddle, but the young woman felt their meaning. Life had been cruel to her family, and yet there were moments like this, moments of help and kindness, that reminded her there was more than suffering. She nodded slightly, though she knew he could not see it in the firelight. He continued, speaking softly about the forest, about its seasons, and about the creatures that lived within it. His knowledge was deep, precise, and full of respect. The young woman could see that he had lived here for many winters, learning from the land rather than trying to control it. She felt a sudden urge to share something of her own life, something that had been buried under years of hardship. The warrior's calm presence made it easier to speak, as if he were a mirror reflecting her courage back at her. She began to tell him small stories of her childhood, the simple joys of Christmas mornings, the sound of laughter around the fireplace, the warmth of her family even in hard times. Her words were halting at first, but as she continued, she could see him listening attentively. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding, and that understanding gave her the courage to speak more freely, to reveal a part of herself she had almost forgotten existed. Her father, too, began to speak, recounting tales from their travels, the difficulties they had faced, and the narrow escapes that had kept them alive. The warrior listened without interruption, his face calm, his posture relaxed yet alert. Occasionally, he nodded slightly, acknowledging the hardships they had endured. There was a quiet respect in the way he treated their words, a respect that the young woman had not expected. She realized then that he was not just a protector, he was a listener, someone who understood that stories themselves could be a source of strength. The young woman noticed that the warrior did not share much about himself at first. He spoke of the land, of survival, and of simple truths about life, but he did not reveal personal details. Yet, in his actions, in the way he moved, and in the careful attention he paid to the fire in the family, she sensed a history rich with experience. There was pain in him, she could tell, but it was quiet, controlled, and hidden beneath a layer of strength. Slowly she realized that this Christmas night was not only about her family surviving the cold, but also about learning something from the warrior himself, lessons about courage, honor, and resilience. As the fire crackled and sparks danced into the air, the young woman began to ask questions. She asked about the forest, about how he had learned to move so silently and with such confidence. He answered without pride, speaking instead of respect for the land and the importance of observation and patience. He described how every season brought new challenges, how animals moved, and how snow and wind could be both friend and foe. She listened closely, absorbing his words, feeling that every lesson contained a deeper truth about life itself. Hours passed, but the fire never died, and the young woman's fear slowly gave way to fascination. She began to understand the balance in the warrior's world, a balance between strength and kindness, caution and trust. She realized that this night, this meeting in the middle of the snow-covered forest, was teaching her more than survival skills. It was teaching her about humanity, about choices, about how one could face danger without losing compassion. And in the quiet moments when the wind whistled outside and the snow fell in heavy flakes, she felt a strange sense of connection with him, a connection that went beyond words or even understanding. Her mother, too, seemed to relax in the presence of the warrior. She spoke softly about her hopes for the future, for safety, for a life that could be warmer and brighter than the one they had known. The warrior listened without interruption, offering small gestures of comfort, a nod, a careful glance, a subtle movement that reassured them they were safe. The young woman realized that kindness did not always need words. Sometimes it was in the actions, in the attention, in the willingness to stay when others might leave. The young woman's father finally leaned back, exhaustion showing in his face, but also something else: gratitude. He had been wary at first, suspicious of this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. But now he understood. The warrior had saved them, yes, but he had also offered something more: hope. The young woman felt the same. She had been terrified when they were alone in the forest, but now she felt a strange peace. She could not explain it, and perhaps she did not need to. The warrior's presence, the fire, and the sharing of stories had created a space of safety, understanding, and quiet joy in the midst of danger. As the night deepened even further, the young woman noticed the small, subtle ways the warrior cared for them. He adjusted blankets, checked the fire carefully, and even placed a small barrier of branches to block the wind. Every movement was deliberate, protective, and respectful. She realized that his strength was not in violence or power, but in the quiet acts of care, in the attention he paid to the smallest details. And she felt a deep respect for him in return, a respect that mingled with gratitude and awe. Eventually, conversation slowed, but the fire continued to burn. The young woman leaned back, feeling the warmth seep into her bones, and looked around at her family. Her mother's face was calm, her father's tense lines softened slightly, and the warrior sat nearby, his posture relaxed but still alert. She realized that this night, which had begun with fear and uncertainty, had transformed into something extraordinary. It was a night of understanding, of connection, and of lessons that would stay with them forever. Before sleep could overtake them, the young woman felt the urge to speak one more time. She asked the warrior about his own story, about how he had learned to survive in the forest, and why he had chosen to help them. For the first time, he spoke of personal experience, not in detail, but enough to hint at a life shaped by hardship, honor, and courage. He spoke of loss and survival, of families and communities, and of the deep respect required to live in harmony with the land. The young woman listened intently, feeling that each word carried weight, wisdom, and a quiet dignity that was almost sacred. As the night wore on, the young woman felt sleep pulling at her, but she did not close her eyes immediately. She wanted to remember every detail of this encounter: the fire, the forest, the way the snow fell silently around them, the sound of the warrior's voice, and the way he had created a space of trust and warmth in the middle of a cold, dangerous night. She realized that this was a Christmas unlike any other. A Christmas defined not by gifts or decorations, but by human connection, courage, and the quiet kindness of a stranger who had stepped into their lives. Finally, she allowed herself to rest, leaning against her mother and feeling the heat of the fire on her face. The warrior remained nearby, alert but calm, a steady presence that allowed them to sleep safely. She knew that the stories shared tonight, the lessons learned, and the bond formed in the flickering light of the fire would stay with her forever. And deep in her heart, she felt a sense of gratitude and hope that she had not known for many years. This Christmas night in the middle of a vast snow-covered forest had become a turning point. It was not the end of fear or hardship, but it was the beginning of understanding, connection, and a recognition that even in the darkest moments, there could be light, guidance, and humanity. The young woman drifted into sleep, carrying the warmth of the fire, the lessons of the warrior, and the quiet joy of shared stories into her dreams, unaware that this night would change everything about how she viewed the world, survival, and the meaning of true kindness. The fire had burned low in the clearing, but its warmth still reached them, chasing away the harsh bite of the winter night. The young woman sat close to her family, feeling the calm of the forest around them, and yet her mind was restless. She had never experienced a night like this: dark, cold, and yet filled with an unexpected sense of safety. The warrior's presence was steady and quiet, like the earth itself, and it filled the small circle of light with strength and reassurance. She could see his eyes reflecting the fire, steady, watchful, and yet not threatening. The family had eaten what little food they had managed to carry, and the silence that followed was comfortable, not tense. They were tired, yes, but there was also a strange sense of peace. The young woman noticed the way the warrior looked toward the edge of the forest, listening intently, and yet he remained calm, as if he had faced far worse than the cold and darkness of this night. She admired him quietly, feeling the growing awareness that he was not just a protector, but someone who understood life and danger in a way she never could. Hours had passed, yet the night was far from over. The wind howled around them, pushing snow against the trees and across the clearing. But inside the small circle of firelight, there was a bubble of warmth and safety. The young woman could not stop thinking about how fragile life could be, how a single misstep, a single moment of carelessness, could have left them lost in the forest forever. And yet here they were, alive, protected, and even allowed a sense of calm they had not known in months. The warrior finally spoke, his voice soft, but commanding enough to draw everyone's attention. "The forest is quiet now," he said, "but it is never truly still. Every tree, every snowflake, every shadow has meaning. You must remember that life is fragile, but it is also precious." His words hung in the air, and the young woman felt their weight. She understood instinctively that he was not just speaking about survival in the forest, he was speaking about life itself. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind outside. It was the understanding that sometimes the greatest gift a person could give was protection, care, and attention. Her father nodded slowly, his eyes meeting the warrior's in silent acknowledgement. He had been wary at first, suspicious of this man who had appeared out of nowhere, but now he understood. The warrior had saved them, yes, but he had also given them something more valuable, a sense of hope, a moment of trust, and a lesson about kindness in a harsh world. The young woman felt a swelling gratitude in her chest, but also a nervousness. She knew that soon they would have to leave this clearing and continue their journey. The warrior had guided them this far, but the forest would not wait for them forever. The young woman shifted closer to the fire, glancing at the warrior. She wanted to ask him more about himself, about why he had helped them, and about the life he had lived in the forest. But the words seemed inadequate, too small to capture the depth of what she felt. She watched him instead, noticing the small, careful movements as he tended to the fire and adjusted the branches around them to keep the wind at bay. There was a quiet wisdom in every action, a silent message that even the smallest gestures could carry great importance. Then, the warrior made a gesture toward her. He held out his hand, and in it was something small, carefully wrapped in a piece of soft cloth. The young woman's eyes widened. She had expected no gifts, no tokens, no reminders that this night was special beyond the warmth and safety it had provided. Yet here, in the middle of a snow-covered forest, the warrior offered her a gift, not gold, not jewels, not something material, but something far more meaningful. "This is for you," he said, his voice calm but carrying a quiet gravity. "It is not a gift in the way you might expect. It is a promise." The young woman hesitated, taking the small bundle with trembling hands. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a simple object, one that seemed ordinary at first but carried weight beyond its size. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. "Why? Why me?" she asked softly. The warrior met her gaze steadily. "Because life is precious," he said. "And sometimes the greatest gift you can give is to protect it. You are that gift tonight." His words sank into her mind slowly, their meaning deepening with each passing moment. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming emotion. The danger, the cold, the fear, they all faded for a moment, replaced by an understanding that this night, this moment, was extraordinary. The young woman's parents watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of relief, gratitude, and wonder. They understood, without words, the significance of what had just happened. The warrior had saved their daughter, yes, but he had also given her something intangible yet infinitely valuable. Recognition, respect, and a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, human kindness could exist. She held the gift close to her chest, feeling its weight, both physical and emotional. The warrior spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "My gift is you," he said. The words were simple, yet they carried a depth that the young woman could not fully grasp in that moment. They were not just words of protection, they were words of acknowledgement, of respect, of the belief that the life she carried, her courage, her hope, her determination, was itself a treasure. For a moment, silence fell over the clearing. The wind outside continued to howl, the snow fell softly, and the fire flickered and danced. Yet inside that small circle of light, time seemed to stand still. The young woman felt a strange sense of peace, of connection, and of understanding. She realized that this night, which had begun with fear and uncertainty, had transformed into something unforgettable. It was a night of recognition, of gifts given and received that had nothing to do with objects and everything to do with life itself. She looked up at the warrior, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know what to say," she admitted. This means more than I can explain." He nodded, understanding, but did not speak. The young woman realized then that words were not necessary. The gesture, the presence, and the promise were enough. The understanding between them was silent but complete. A bridge of trust and respect formed in the middle of a cold, dangerous night. The fire burned steadily, and the young woman finally allowed herself to rest against her mother, holding the small gift close. She could feel her heart slowing, her breathing steadying, and a calm settling over her that she had not known for hours. The warrior remained nearby, alert but relaxed, a watchful guardian who had chosen to step into their lives at exactly the right moment. She understood with a quiet certainty that this night would remain with her forever, not just as a memory but as a lesson about life, courage, and the meaning of true gifts. Minutes turned into hours, and the first faint light of dawn began to touch the edges of the forest. The snow glimmered softly, and the wind had eased. The young woman opened her eyes and looked at the warrior one last time before the journey ahead. She saw the quiet strength in his eyes, the calm wisdom in his face, and the deep respect that had defined every action of the night. She felt a profound gratitude that words could never fully express. Her father finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "We should prepare to move," he said. The young woman nodded, carefully placing the gift into her pack, feeling its weight and the responsibility it represented. The warrior stood and gestured toward the trail they had come from. He would accompany them only part of the way, guiding them to a safe direction before the forest reclaimed its silence. The young woman felt a pang of sadness at the thought of parting, but she also understood. The lessons, the gift, and the promise would stay with her forever, no matter the distance. As they began to walk through the snow-covered forest, the young woman glanced back at the clearing. The fire was still burning, a small beacon of warmth and light in the vast wilderness. She understood that this night, this extraordinary night of danger, kindness, and understanding, would define her. The warrior had given her more than safety. He had given her a gift that could not be measured in material terms. He had given her hope, recognition, and the knowledge that even in the harshest conditions, human kindness could endure. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the warrior paused, turning to face them fully. His eyes met hers, steady and calm, and he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The young woman felt her heart swell with gratitude. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words seemed adequate. She simply nodded in return, understanding that this night, this gift, and this meeting would remain with her for the rest of her life. And then, without another word, the warrior melted back into the shadows of the forest, becoming one with the land he had so carefully protected. The young woman watched him disappear, feeling a mixture of sadness, wonder, and deep respect. She knew they might never meet again, yet she also understood that the gift he had given, the promise, the recognition, and the lesson, would be carried with her forever. The sun rose slowly over the snow-covered forest, casting a soft golden light across the trees. The young woman walked carefully with her family, the small bundle that the warrior had given her tucked safely into her pack. Each step through the snow felt lighter now, as if the warmth and courage from the night before had settled into her bones. She glanced around at the forest, which looked less threatening in the morning light. The wind no longer seemed as sharp, the shadows no longer as dark, and yet she could still feel the presence of the warrior in her mind, the quiet strength, the calm wisdom, and the gift he had given her. Her father led the way, scanning the path ahead, while her mother kept close to her side. They walked in silence for a long while, each lost in thought. The young woman kept her eyes on the snow, remembering every detail of the night before, the firelight dancing on the trees, the way the warrior had moved, and the way he had spoken when he handed her the gift. She realized that this Christmas night had been unlike any other she had known. It was not about presents, food, or decorations. It was about survival, courage, and the kindness of a stranger who had stepped into their lives when they needed help most. As they continued their journey, the young woman thought about the lessons she had learned from the warrior. He had shown her that strength was not measured in force or power but in patience, understanding, and the quiet acts of care that could save a life. He had demonstrated that courage could exist alongside compassion, that even in a harsh world one could choose to protect rather than harm. She felt these lessons settle deeply within her, like seeds planted in the snow, waiting to grow as she moved forward through life. The family traveled steadily, the forest slowly giving way to a clearer path that led toward the distant settlement. The snow underfoot was easier to navigate, and the fear that had gripped the young woman the night before had eased into a quiet confidence. She realized that the warrior's gift was more than the small object he had handed her. It was the trust he had placed in her, the recognition of her strength, and the understanding that even in the darkest moments, hope could shine. Every step she took reminded her of that, and she carried it with a growing sense of pride and gratitude. Her mother spoke softly as they walked, breaking the silence that had settled over them. She told stories of past Christmases, of small joys and family traditions that had been lost over time. The young woman listened, smiling faintly, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the connection she shared with her family. They were survivors and they were together. That realization, she understood, was the greatest gift of all. It was a gift that the warrior had helped them recognize, not with words alone, but with his presence, his actions, and the quiet understanding he had offered in the cold of the night. Hours passed and the settlement began to appear on the horizon. Small lights twinkled through the snow, and the young woman felt a rush of relief. They were almost home, almost safe, and the fear that had clutched her heart was finally beginning to loosen. Yet she also felt a bittersweet pang. This journey, this night in the forest, had changed her forever. She knew she would never forget the warrior, the fire, or the words he had spoken. "My gift is you." Those words had become a part of her, a reminder of strength, courage, and the power of human kindness. When they finally reached the settlement, the young woman's family was greeted warmly by friends and neighbors who had been worried about them. The warmth of the homes, the laughter of children, and the smell of bread and pine filled the air. It was a stark contrast to the cold, quiet forest they had just left behind. Her parents embraced her and each other tightly, tears mixing with smiles, and she felt a profound sense of belonging. The safety of the settlement was a relief, but it also reminded her of the fragile nature of life, of the nights when survival depended not just on skill or strength, but on the kindness of strangers. The young woman spent the next few days recovering from the journey, sharing stories of their escape with the people of the settlement. She spoke of the cold, the fear, and the snow, but also of the warrior who had saved them. She described his quiet strength, his careful movements, and the small gift that had carried meaning far beyond its size. The people listened with wide eyes, marveling at the courage of both the young woman and the warrior. They understood, in a way she could not fully express, that this night had been a turning point, not just for her family, but for her own understanding of life, survival, and the power of human connection. Days turned into weeks, and the young woman began to settle into life in the settlement. She helped her family rebuild their home and tend to small tasks, but her mind often wandered back to the forest. She thought about the warrior, about his lessons, and about the way he had shown her that even in danger, there could be hope. She realized that the gift he had given her was not something that could be held or displayed. It was a way of seeing the world differently, a way of recognizing the value of life, courage, and kindness in every moment. One evening, As she sat by the fire in their new home, she took out the small object the warrior had given her. She held it carefully, feeling its weight and remembering his words. "My gift is you." She smiled softly, understanding now that the gift was not just for her. It was a promise, a lesson, and a reminder of the night that had changed everything. She felt a quiet determination settle over her. She would carry this lesson forward, in her actions, her thoughts, and the way she treated others. She would honor the gift by living with courage, kindness, and awareness of the fragile beauty of life. As Christmas approached once again, the young woman prepared a small celebration for her family. It was simple, but it was filled with meaning. They decorated a small tree, shared bread and sweets, and told stories of the past year. Yet in her heart, the young woman remembered the forest, the warrior, and the firelight that had warmed her in the coldest night of her life. She realized that this memory and the gift it represented was a gift that would remain with her forever. It was not about the physical object. It was about life, survival, and the kindness that could be found even in the darkest moments. Years passed, but the young woman never forgot the warrior or the lessons of that Christmas night. She spoke often to her family about the importance of courage, kindness, and understanding, passing down the story so that it would not be lost. She shared the lessons she had learned in the forest, teaching that survival was not just about strength or skill, but about respect, observation, and the willingness to protect others. And in her heart, she carried the quiet knowledge that a single act of kindness could change a life forever. Sometimes, she would walk along the edge of the forest, remembering the fire and the snow, and she would imagine the warrior moving silently among the trees. She wondered if he had survived the winters as he had promised, if he had continued to guide and protect those in need. She never saw him again, but the presence of his lessons remained. She realized that this was the true meaning of the gift. It was a guiding light, a reminder of the strength of the human spirit and the power of one person's courage and kindness to touch the lives of others. As she grew older, the young woman carried this lesson into every part of her life. She faced challenges with courage, treated others with compassion, and approached the world with awareness of its fragility and beauty. She understood that the warrior's gift had not only saved her life, but had shaped the person she had become. And in the quiet moments, when snow fell softly outside and the fire burned warmly within, she remembered the words that had changed everything. "My gift is you." That Christmas night in the forest had been more than a night of survival. It had been a night of learning, of connection, and of recognition. The young woman realized that sometimes the greatest gifts are not objects, but moments, lessons, and the understanding that even in the harshest conditions human kindness can endure. She carried that knowledge with her forever, sharing it through her actions, her words, and the way she lived her life. And in that way, the warrior's gift continued to shape the world, long after the snow had melted and the forest had returned to its quiet state. In the end, the young woman understood that life was fragile, beautiful, and full of unexpected gifts. The warrior had shown her that one act of courage and kindness could ripple through time, changing the lives of many. She knew that she would never forget that night, the fire, the snow, or the words that had echoed through her heart, "My gift is you." And with that knowledge, she faced each day with courage, hope, and gratitude, knowing that the lessons of the past could guide her into a brighter, kinder future.